Pause whatever you're doing. Breathe deep and hear me. What you are about to hear is not a message. It is a mirror. And what it reflects may unsettle you, or it may awaken something ancient, something defiant. I do not speak to you from a stage. I speak from the soil, from the red dust of Burkina Faso, where revolutions are not legends but memory. My name is Ibrahim Traoré, but this is not about a name. It is about a question that haunts me, and now I pass it to you. What if everything you were taught about your place in this world was never true? What if history had been edited so you would forget that you once ruled, once built, once led? You may say, but what does this have to do with me? Let me answer you plainly, everything. Because when one part of our body is bleeding, the whole body suffers. And when Africa rises, it will not rise alone. Stay with me, this is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe and stand with us. Pause here. Let me paint a picture you need to see clearly. I came to power not with pomp, but with a mission and a warning. In September 2022, I led a decisive turn of the tide in Burkina Faso, sweeping out a caretaker regime that had failed our people. At 34, I became one of the world's youngest heads of state. Yet this was no triumph of youth, but a spark of sovereignty erupting from the ashes of frustration. Do you feel the soil of our country under your feet? Our earth remembers. It remembers Thomas Sankara. It remembers resistance. I did not ascend to glory, I responded to a cry. For too long we were governed by hands not our own. For too long our policies were made to please lenders, not laborers. I stood not above the people, but with them, boots in the same dust, hands weathered by the same calluses of hunger, fear, and patience that had run out. As president, I tore the veil of dependence. We ended the presence of French forces once stationed on our land, refusing to be sheltered by patronage. Instead, we chose alliances made of purpose, not promise. We became co-founders of the Alliance of Sahel States, a pact of solidarity with Mali and Niger, forged under the necessity of mutual defense, independence from old blocs, and a vision of self-determination. Critics called it a break from order. We called it a return to ourselves. Sovereignty is not a slogan, it is structure, and structure begins beneath the surface. We declare the soil sacred again, not just because it is where our ancestors rest, but because it holds the key to feeding our children, funding our dreams, and defending our dignity. In November 2023, we launched our first national gold refinery. For decades, we dug our minerals and sent them away, raw and unfinished, watching others turn our dust into their fortune. But that refinery changed everything. The dust we dug from our own ground was no longer exported raw. It became the seed of our economic power, processed at home. In 2025, we went further. We nationalized mining sites, including Bungo and Watnion, reclaiming control of what was always ours. Some asked, "Isn't this dangerous?" I replied, "What's more dangerous, relying on the same hands that kept us poor, or daring to use our own?" For every ounce of gold now held by the state, there is a school rebuilt, a road repaired, a field irrigated. This is not about gold, it's about dignity. Every kilogram represents the sweat of our people, no longer sold for pieces of paper, but exchanged for futures, for ownership, for proof that our sweat is worth more than applause, it is worth equity. But understand this, when you build a nation from its ground up, the enemy does not attack the walls. They strike the foundation, the unity, the hope, the consciousness. They call it populism. They call it radical. But ask yourself, since when did feeding your people, protecting your borders, and owning your own resources become a crime? I remember standing on a dusty platform, looking out at a crowd not chanting my name, but chanting their own power. That was when I knew we had passed the point of no return. Because when a people remember their worth, no threat, no sanction, no smear can make them forget again. And yet I also knew, the brighter the flame, the longer the shadow. There were forces that would not watch silently. There were interests that could not afford our success. That is the story they'd rather you never hear. And that is where our next trial begins. What enemies lie in wait, not with bullets, but with whispers, distraction, and division? Do you feel that weight in the air? That sense that something is coming for us? Not just armies, but whispers, betrayal, and the cold edge of ambition. I know it well because I've lived it. Since coming to power, I have faced more than one attempt on my life, a relentless barrage, at times whispered, at times declared. Rumors, headlines, half-truths, some say 18 assassination attempts, others call it propaganda. But I ask you, is the number more frightening than the reason? Why would anyone want me silenced if my leadership truly posed no threat to empire? They do not fear bullets. They fear what happens when the people rally behind a voice that refuses to bow. That is the real danger I represent. I remember the morning one such rumor surfaced, whispers that another attempt had been foiled. My advisors looked uneasy. I felt no fear, only clarity. I turned to them and said, "If they want a war of shadows, we will answer with light." I did not need to speak louder because the people did it for me. In Ouagadougou, thousands flooded the streets, not in fear but in fire. They chanted my name not as a savior but as a symbol. Banners rose above the crowd. "Long live the revolution! We stand with Traore." And most tellingly, Africa is not afraid. I saw old women barefoot, fists raised. I saw children sitting on shoulders, eyes wide with something new, not just pride, but agency. The chants were not rehearsed. They were ancestral. They were echoes of Sankara, of Lumumba, of Nkrumah. They were saying, "We have not forgotten." That is what scares them most. I heard one elder say, "They may take his life, but not this moment." And I thought, so this is what resistance looks like. It is not found in rifles, but in the rhythm of the people who refuse to scatter. And yet, amid cheers and chants, another force moved quietly. Not bullets, but broadcasts. Not coups, but columns of disinformation. They said I was a tyrant, that I crushed dissent, that I ruled by fear. They never showed the citizens' forums I hosted, the direct calls I made to villages, the nights I sat and listened, not as a ruler, but as a son of this soil. Still, I saw how fear could be rebranded as order and how sovereignty could be reframed as instability. Some local journalists vanished. Others began to self-censor. International outlets played the same loop. Instability, insurgency, authoritarianism. They never mentioned what we were building in the margins. They never reported on the thousands who came to rebuild roads with their bare hands, or the soldiers who turned down salaries to defend their towns with pride. And so I made a choice. If they fight with illusion, we will respond with visibility. I stood before our people and declared, "I am not the revolution. You are. And if I fall, let no one mourn unless they also rise." It was not drama, it was necessity. Because I knew this, they do not assassinate leaders, they assassinate hope. And in Burkina Faso, hope had become dangerous. I tightened our security. I slept in different places each night, not out of fear but strategy. I said to myself, "You are not a man. You are a movement now." Movements don't sleep in the same bed twice. But the real threat wasn't death. It was division. When trust fractures, no wall can hold. So I asked myself, how do we keep the fire without letting it consume us? I began to listen harder. I walked without cameras. I asked farmers, teachers, market women, "Do you believe this still matters?" They said yes. Not because of me, but because they had tasted something they couldn't forget. Agency. And that is how I knew we were still alive. Because movements do not die when leaders fall. They die when people forget why they stood up in the first place. As I write this, there may already be another whisper, another plot. I do not lose sleep over it. What keeps me up is this question. Will we hold the line, not just in streets, but in spirit? Because as we rebuild that bridge of unity, another force gathers strength, not from outside our borders, but swirling within, in our minds and on our screens. What happens when the enemy is no longer external, but inside our narrative? If you thought the blaze of our unity and resistance was a victory, pause. Let me show you the other side of that fire. Since I took the stage, Burkina Faso has endured wounds that go deeper than gunshots. Violence has grown crueler and more widespread. In the years following the coup of 2022, militant attacks surged. Civilian deaths climbed into the tens of thousands. And those numbers, however cold they sound, are made of real names, real futures, real children no longer running through schoolyards. In the first half of 2025 alone, hundreds of thousands were forced to flee their homes. Schools, thousands of them, were closed. Nearly 2 million children were left without classrooms. Our clinics, already fragile, crumbled under the weight of insecurity. More than 4 million people now walk in the shadow of unmet medical needs. I ask you to picture a child learning under the shade of no roof. A field once fertile, now suffocated by fear. Our people are dispersed like seeds blown far from home, yet they need nourishment to root again. You cannot build dreams on soil soaked in fear. And what about the deeper scars? In towns like Solenzo, civilians were rounded up and executed, over 100 gone in a single sweep. Days later, in places like Diapaga, militants retaliated with brutal force, killing dozens of soldiers and civilian defenders. The violence is not random. It is a message. Each bullet says, "You cannot build." Each explosion tries to tell us that sovereignty is a dream. But I do not accept that message. Because even in the ashes we plant, even in the silence we speak, still truth must be spoken. Violence is not symmetrical. It is strategic. The breakdown in trust between government and communities leaves a vacuum that others are eager to fill. A single flash of gunfire can undo years of resilience. And in that vacuum, doubt grows fast. Meanwhile, headlines whisper of plots. Tentative d'assassinat Ibrahim Traoré, they say. Assassination attempts. Destabilization. Rumors swirl. And though not all are verified, each wave of news is like a crack in the mirror, meant not to break the glass entirely, but to distort the image we see of ourselves. But the real target is not the man. It is the memory, the resolve, the unity we cling to. They do not need to destroy us with weapons. They can dismantle us with narratives. They can make us believe we are alone, ineffective, doomed. And that is why I speak clearly now. Beyond the bullets and borders, there is a wider siege, a siege on our humanity, on our future. Epidemics return, measles, hepatitis, yellow fever, flaring up in the empty space left by weakened systems. Humanitarian corridors shrink, aid falters, and through it all, 4 million souls walk in the shadow of uncertainty. Let me be honest, we are not winning every battle. Not yet. There are places where militants still roam freely. There are families who bury their loved ones with no flags, no ceremonies, just silence. And that silence must haunt us. Because if we stop hearing it, we stop caring. But in this darkness, there grows a hard clarity. The pain that fractures is not destiny, it is a forge. And if unity can kindle strength, then isolation will always extinguish it. We do not need pity. We need partners. We do not need applause. We need autonomy. And most of all, we do not need saviors. We need to save ourselves by building systems no bullet can dismantle. Roads, markets, institutions, memory. The harvest will not grow in every field, but it will grow in enough to keep us moving. Because hope is a crop that blooms unevenly, but spreads if tended. And still we must face the truth. Even as our bodies bear these wounds, there is another battlefield unfolding on screens, in embassies, in shadowed negotiations far from our soil. How will our story be shaped when the global stage is no longer just watching, but rewriting the script? I want you to step back and see how our revolution echoes across the world stage. When I removed foreign forces from our homeland, when I took the path away from old allegiances, the international world leaned forward, some in applause, others in alarm. ECOWAS and the African Union leapt first, condemning our departure from constitutional norms, suspending our membership, calling for a return to systems they claim are sacrosanct. Their words wrapped around us as heavy chains, chains we dared to break. They spoke of legality. We spoke of legitimacy. France, once our patron, now expressed concern over its citizens' safety as embassies trembled at the new reality. Their flags came down not in protest but in panic. The United States issued statements laced with concern, carefully worded, heavy with implication. We urge a return to democratic order. But whose definition of order were they protecting? Meanwhile, new hands extended. Russia moved not with force, but with subtlety. Wagner's shadows may have stirred unease in Paris, but here in the Sahel, they stirred a question. If one empire fails to listen, must we not at least entertain another? And yet we are not naive. Alignment is not allegiance. Partnership is not servitude. We do not trade one chain for another. What we seek is not a new master, it is a new map. And that map is being drawn. With Mali, with Niger, with the alliance of Sahel states. A constellation forming not around dominance but defense. A pact not signed in foreign halls but on soil still wet from struggle. And still the world watched us through a narrow lens. Western media labeled us erratic, unstable, dangerous. Commentators questioned our capacity to govern. They saw protests and called them chaos. They heard our refusal and called it rebellion. But when the whisper of tentative d'assassinat Ibrahim Traoré rippled across headlines, the fear was not in the act. It was in the idea that such a leader had gained so much symbolic power. The question behind their questions was always this: what if he succeeds? What if people like him, young, African, unapologetic, become the new voice of governance? That is why they speak so loudly while listening so little. That is why they deploy diplomats and drones in the same breath. That is why they do not fear coups, they fear awakenings. And now a larger truth rises. We were never truly isolated. We were silenced. But silence is ending. Our alliances may not follow the old script. Our media may not speak with borrowed words. Our future will not be translated through their dictionaries. As our rebellion becomes global vocabulary, the final question emerges: will the world rewrite us as anomalies, or will our story be written by our own hands? I will not lie to you. The road ahead is not smooth. It is steep, broken in places, and lined with eyes hoping we will stumble. But I say this: we have already crossed the hardest part. We remembered who we are. Now the question is not whether we survive. It is whether we build. We must build systems rooted in our own values, not borrowed visions. Education that teaches truth, not obedience. Media that reflects our voices, not distorts them. Economies where we refine what we extract and invest where we live. Courts that deliver justice without delay or deception. This is not utopia. This is infrastructure of dignity. Some fear that without foreign aid we will collapse. I fear that with it we will never rise. Because every coin that arrives with conditions is not a gift, it is a leash. Sovereignty cannot be subcontracted. But unity, that is our wealth. I have walked through markets where women organize trade routes better than ministers. I have spoken to youth who code solutions in internet cafes lit by candlelight. I have sat with elders who, without degrees, understand diplomacy more than those in embassies. This is what they fear: our ordinary brilliance. The genius that hides in plain sight. The creativity that thrives without permission. The solutions that emerge from scarcity and shame and turn into strength. We are not waiting for permission to act. We are building bridges between the Sahel and the diaspora, between village and innovation hub, between memory and ambition. And to my brothers and sisters across oceans, the door is not just open, it is waiting. Not for saviors, not for spectators, but for builders, visionaries, and farmers of the future. There is land here, yes. But more than that, there is purpose. There are hands needed in factories, in classrooms, in ministries, in farms. There are children who deserve to hear the story not of struggle, but of triumph. There are forests yet to be planted that will shade generations unborn. And there is healing to be done, deep healing, generational healing. Healing that can only happen when disconnection ends. Let us stop asking if we are ready. Let us start planting. Let us build institutions not with bricks but with values. Let us create futures that do not imitate old empires, but imagine new harmonies. Because the next harvest will not come from foreign soil, it will grow from our hands or not at all. We are not what they wrote about us. We are what we remember and what we choose to become. For too long, they told the story of Africa without Africa. For too long, Black voices were spoken of, but not heard. That ends now. If you search for Ibrahim Traoré news, you may find reports of rebellion, instability, risk. But they do not tell you this, that what they call risk, we call rebirth. That what they name instability, we name independence. That what they fear is not a man, but a movement. A movement that stretches across borders, across languages, across centuries of forced silence. A movement that says, we are one. They do not show you the builders, the healers, the thinkers, the farmers. They do not show you the children whose eyes are full of questions, questions we must answer by the way we live. They do not show you the roads we lay with our own hands, or the futures we fund with courage, not credit. But we are showing them now. And yes, whispers will continue. Articles will be written. Accusations will fly. Perhaps again they will whisper, tentative d'assassinat Ibrahim Traoré. But I am still here. And more importantly, we are still here. Creating, building, refusing to disappear. The future is not waiting. It is watching. It is listening. It is asking, who will shape me? Let it be us. Let it be now. Because if we rise together, not just in protest, but in purpose, there is no force on earth that can hold us back. This is not charity, not pity, not aid with conditions. This is sovereignty. This is family. This is return. So if someone searches again for Ibrahim Traoré news, let them find not just headlines, but a rising continent, unafraid to speak in its own voice, ready to shape its own destiny. Share this message. Let it reach someone who forgot who they were. Let it remind someone who always knew. And let it plant something deep in the ones yet to be born. The bridge is waiting. The future is listening. Cross it.